Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones to get some interview tips for non-traditional law students. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm here with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking with ex-BigLaw recruiter Sadie Jones to get some interview tips for non-traditional law students. So welcome, Sadie.
Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. So to start off with, who are we really talking about here? I mean, what do we mean when we say a non-traditional law student?
I think that can mean something different to different people. I generally would say it was maybe somebody who had a career between undergrad and law school, maybe an older law student, maybe somebody, who had kind of gone a different route than just sort of straight through.
I think that's right. I mean, the traditional idea was just people who went from undergrad to law school, maybe worked a year or something like that, and then went to law school. But more and more, that's not even really the case. So, I think more and more people are going back to law school after, say, 3 to 5 years at least of doing something different. I mean, that's more of the business school model anyway, where they don't take people without work experience typically. In my case, like I had studied architecture, I did a master's, and then I had a programming career for a couple of years. So I would say I was arguably on the non-traditional side. I mean, at least I had something I had to explain to people.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes it's not even just that you had work experience, but maybe like you had work experience in a totally different area. So maybe when they're kind of reading your resume or your material, it doesn't naturally fit into, why did you decide to go to law school now?
Right. I mean, if you worked 3 years,
I think that's it.
If you worked 3 years as a paralegal, that's not probably like a non-traditional law student. If you worked 20 years as a paralegal and then you decided that you wanted to go to law school, I think you would fall more into this category.
Right, exactly. But yeah, if you, let's say, worked in investment banking for a couple of years, I don't think that's non-traditional.
That's pretty traditional in certain law schools.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of things where you could have some work experience, but it doesn't necessarily fit into this category. So to me, it's sort of your story needs to be explained a little bit more.
Right. So let's talk about that. Because I could even see, as you were talking about that, I was thinking even somebody who, say, was like a fine art major and then went into law school, even that, I mean, even though they're the standard like mid-20s, they might really need to explain that too.
Definitely. So I think you should just be prepared.
Yeah. So let's talk about what kind of special challenges do you think students like this face? Have you seen?
Well, I think they basically face the challenge of having to explain their background and having to explain how they ended up in law school and, what they want to do going forward and how this is the path they want to take.
Right. I think that's exactly right. I mean, certainly with my background, I definitely had to lay out for the average interviewer what value this had. And I think that's a productive way of looking at it, is not so much, I have to explain this weird thing, but what value is this adding? Yes, this is a different background than the average person you're going to talk to, but what does it help me bring to the table that you're not going to get with those other people? So, when somebody looked at my resume, they basically looked at it and they said, sociology to architecture to programming to law. Tell me about that. And I had to have an answer that was basically ready to go to explain to them why this made sense and why it was valuable. And so whatever your background is, I think you want to think about how you're going to get these questions. You know that you're going to get them. So you may as well be prepared with an answer that turns it in your favor.
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of these things can be positives. I think you need to go into the interview feeling that they are positives yourself, because I think that's a lot of the challenge, is that it sort of comes off if it's something that you're insecure about or feel like is a negative or is going to be viewed negatively. I think they know that also. So I think you want to go in explaining why all of this stuff is helpful, to your future career as a lawyer.
I agree. I think sometimes people can get very defensive about things, like either because they've changed paths and they feel like they wasted time or wasted money, or because they feel like, they took time off for family obligations or something like that, and they feel like that is going to be undervalued in the workplace. And sometimes, people really want to make it about like, oh, but I was doing this volunteer work on the side. And, oftentimes people are like, you don't really have to justify this. Like,
Yeah. I think that's worse. I think that feels fake to me.
Right. Exactly. It's like, if you were basically like at home with your family and then you did some other stuff, but, just own that.
Yeah. And I think, in today's world, I think people sort of understand that like things happen. And I think if you're, upfront about it in a way, that you've sort of crafted the story a little bit, I think they will understand. But I think if you sort of brush it under the rug and kind of, don't talk about it or act like you're insecure or ashamed, I think they'll pick up on that too. And that's going to be way worse than just saying what it is.
Right.
Some people have medical issues. They had to leave school for a certain amount of time. All sorts of things.
Yeah, I was going to say, people may have been like taking care of family members who have medical issues or had issues themselves. And, I think with something like that, you just need to make it clear that, you're ready to move forward. You're ready to take on this job. Everything's sorted out. And just not make it a bigger deal than it has to be. So again, like whatever your non-traditional aspect is, or aspects are, because oftentimes these are overlapping. If you've had another career, you may also have had family obligations, that kind of thing. Just make it clear, like, this is where I am and this is where I'm ready to move forward from, and this is what I'm bringing to the table. And if you are confident and you value those things, then I think other people will as well.
Definitely. I agree.
I think another challenge sometimes people can face in this scenario is that they frankly may have other obligations that are not compatible with working all the time. And so this might have impacted grades. It might have impacted your ability to take on different extracurricular activities that were very time intensive. How can people handle this type of thing?
Well, one, I would say in this situation, you also have to know like where you're applying and what their expectations are, and there may be places where even if there's a reason, if your grades aren't up to what they require, it doesn't really matter what your story is. That's just like not going to be an option. So I think you should know that going into it. I also think that you can be upfront about something. So if you had something that sort of, impacted things, let's say a semester or a year, and then you got back on track, I think there's a way to sort of, tell the story about an upward trajectory. But I think that's something you can explain, but you can't hide it, and, you can't change it from what it actually is. Yeah. And I think in terms of extracurriculars, that you can also be upfront about. I don't know that that's the most important thing anyway, but
yeah, again, I just wouldn't get defensive about it. Well, yeah. I was accepted to law review, but I didn't join because of blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, no one really cares. You either did it or you did it or you didn't do it. Like, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and if you didn't do it, you didn't do it. And then you move on to whatever other thing you did.
Yeah, or somebody asks you, like, it looks like you have great grades. Why didn't you do law review? I mean, then it's fair to say, okay, well, I was accepted, but I had some other obligations. It doesn't look great, but it doesn't look horrible. Yeah, and I think your point, which we'll get to in a minute, about applying to the right places is really key, because some of these firms and organizations, it's probably just not really a great fit if you do have a lot of other obligations.
Absolutely. And you don't want to end up in the wrong place for you and your life.
Well, why take that, why take a job at Wachtell, for example, if you have children, you might want to see them occasionally. I mean, I accidentally interviewed with Wachtell at OCI, and the guy, I have no idea how they ended up on my schedule. The guy asked me, oh, why do you want to work at Wachtell? And for whatever reason, I just decided to be completely honest and said, well, I'm not really sure that I do.
That's good.
Well, and then he spent the whole rest of the interview basically probing me on why that was. And we had a very interesting conversation because I was like, well, I think basically your hours are insane and I would like to have some semblance of a life. And he was trying to convince me they weren't really that much worse than any other firm. And it was a very bizarre conversation.
I think that's interesting because I think places like that are not used to, someone not being interested in them.
Yeah, I was like, I honestly, no, I was like, I don't know, maybe they just sign up everybody in the law review for Wachtell without your permission. I have no idea how you got on my list. Like, suffice it to say, I did not get a call back. But, that would have been a terrible place for me with no other obligation. So someone who does have other obligations, probably not your best choice. Another thing that comes up a lot, oftentimes people who are non-traditional are going part-time. So how can people kind of handle that in terms of looking for jobs and that kind of thing?
Well, I think in this case, you definitely need to be realistic about what you can take on. So if you're part-time, I guess it depends on what the reasons are, but if you're part-time, it's probably because you either are working somewhere else or you do have family obligations or something, that takes up a lot of your time. So I would say you need to be very clear on what you're able to take on in terms of something else on top of that.
Yeah, and I think this is definitely a situation where you want to have a well thought out plan. So if you're interviewing somewhere and, they're probably going to be asking you, well, when are you planning on, finishing school, or like, how are you going to fit this in? Like, what is your plan? And you want to have an answer to that. Well, this is exactly what I've thought about, and this is why that would work. So again, just think through it ahead of time and have an answer to questions that are pretty obviously going to come up.
Because I think it's going to be really obvious to the employer, the person on the other side, if, you're not going to be able to do all of these things and you're just saying this to, get a job offer. They're going to realize that. Yeah,
I mean, they probably hired other people who said the same things. It didn't work out. So they're going to be a little skeptical when you say like, oh, well, I'm working part-time and I'm going to school, but I have 20 extra hours a week to devote to this. It's like, really? Do you? It seems unlikely.
I feel like you need to give an example of, I was able to juggle,
right.
Blah, blah, blah last year or whatever.
Exactly. And in the other reality, particularly if somebody's on the on the older student side of the non-traditional spectrum, is the reality is you may face some age discrimination or bias or family bias if you have children. I mean, what do you think people can do about this?
I mean, obviously it's unfortunate and no one should be, asking you inappropriate / illegal questions about any of these things or probing in a way that they shouldn't be. And none of it should be held against you. But I would sort of give the same advice that we gave before about going in confident, how all of these things, make you who you are, which is a capable person and a person who's able to juggle things and to handle all these things. And so I would say, I think that if you go in with that confidence and positivity about it, that's the best you can do.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you're going to face what you're going to face. Sometimes people kind of try to avoid some of these issues by doing things like leaving dates off of the resume and things like that. But the reality is at some point you're probably going to show up for an interview and or people are just going to be suspicious about why you've left things off of your resume anyway. So I feel like, you're a grown up, you're a person, like you have a life history, you have a story. And the more that you just own that confidently, I think, hopefully at least the more people are going to respond to that. And if there are people who would discriminate against you based on these factors, well, they might not be the greatest place to work.
Yeah, I think that's the key to keep in mind too. Also, something for people to realize is you're allowed to bring up whatever you want in the interview. So they can't ask you if you have children or probe about it or anything like that. But if you want to bring it up, like it makes sense in whatever conversation you're having, you can bring it up and, sort of put it out there for you again, if it makes sense. And I think kind of come at it from a positive place.
Right. I mean, how do you think people should handle it if they are being asked these inappropriate / illegal questions about things like family status, age, whatever else it might be in an interview?
This is hard. I feel like this is a hard situation. And coming from the employer side, it would make me so upset to think that somebody I'd trained to interview was asking those questions. And I would want to know. And I do think it's something where you could tell, if you're not comfortable saying it in the interview, you can tell the interviewer or maybe the person who interviewed you on campus, someone you have a relationship, you can say after, I was asked some things that, were inappropriate and made me uncomfortable, that sort of thing. I also think it's completely fine to say in the interview, you're not comfortable with that. And like you said, it probably isn't a place you're interested in working if that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think occasionally, maybe very occasionally, people just aren't thinking and they don't mean it to be, an illegal question. They might just be making conversation like, oh, what ages are your kids or something like that. But that's not actually something they're allowed to ask you. Again, if you bring it up, sure. If you're like, oh, I have 3 kids. Oh, how old are they? That's fine. Maybe, probably even a little borderline there, but basically that's not something you can get that upset about. But if somebody brings this up to you, like, what's your marital status? Are you planning to get married? Are you planning to get pregnant? Like, do you have children? These are really not okay. Or, there are all sorts of other inappropriate questions people could be asking you. But I think, bringing it up later with someone else is totally legitimate. I mean, it means, I don't know. I assume you would not then ding the interviewee for that.
No, absolutely not. I know that the person who was doing the interview would get, a talk from the hiring partner or somebody else, employment partner, about saying things. I do agree with you that there are some times where people just don't realize, and it sounds innocent to them. I think the number one case of that is that people ask candidates all the time where they're from.
Right. What your name? What's your last name from?
Yeah.
Oh, Singh. Are you Sikh? Are you from Kashmir? Yeah. It's like, okay, just don't go there.
But and a lot of times they really do mean it, that maybe you're from the state they're from, and they weren't even implying anything and whatnot. And that doesn't make it okay. They should know better. But I also think you kind of have to feel out, where the line is and what was meant by it, whether you want to say something there or later, whatever you're comfortable with. But I don't think any of that will be held against you.
Yeah, that's clearly on the person who is just basically being an idiot about the entire situation. All right, well, let's back off of those type of questions for a little bit. So what can people who are non-traditional do? We've already talked a little bit about considering where you're applying. How can people find out kind of what's family friendly or what's work-life balance friendly, or even just places that might be open to, people who've had, say, a more creative type of background?
Well, I think you can, do some research, and, there are surveys, there's a lot of publications that talk about different law firms. A lot of this stuff is public, what their, required billing is, if people work part-time, that sort of thing. I think a lot of times you just kind of hear stuff from other law students or people that have worked places, that keep that in mind. I will say that I am generally suspicious of big law firms that describe themselves as a lifestyle firm, because I don't think that's true.
Because that doesn't exist.
Yeah. So I think there are places that are better and worse for that, and there's degrees. But generally, if you are someone who wants to go into big law, you just have to assume that there's not going to be a great work-life balance, definitely not at the beginning and maybe never. And, that shouldn't necessarily be your consideration. And I think it's sort of just a marketing thing that certain firms portray themselves that way and their websites look like that. And they'll tell you a lot of things that aren't necessarily true. in reality, in practice. Like, they might be their policies, but it's like, how many people are really working those number of hours?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think you just have to know what you're getting into. I think within the universe of large law firms, there are definitely like more and less intense places to work, but I would not describe, to my knowledge, a single large law firm I've ever experienced or heard about as a lifestyle option for what the average person would think of as a reasonable work-life balance. That's just not what you're signing up for. So again, like if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I want to have a reasonable work-life balance, you might need to look somewhere else, and that's totally okay. You know, you might want to look at smaller firms, mid-sized firms. You might want to look at different types of organizations that really actually do have a reasonable work-life balance, because those do exist. They just typically pay less.
That's what I was going to say. I think, like, if you're prepared to take a pay cut, and some of these places pay decently.
Yeah.
You know, and there are also other advantages, you know, certain public interest jobs or government jobs. You can get some forgiveness on your student loans sometimes. Mm-hmm. So that's all things to keep in mind. And you do have to say to yourself, how much do I need to make to live?
Right.
And to do all those things. But a lot of times the trade-off might not be worth it, because when you're working all the time, you may say to yourself, it doesn't matter how much they're paying me. I would rather get paid, you know, half of the salary to get to come home and see my loved one.
Right. And I think as a non-traditional student, you typically have a little more perspective. You know, you've had a different career or you've taken time and done other things. So this idea, you know, you're probably hopefully less likely to be led down this path of like, oh, I'm going to make $200,000 and I'm going to have a great life and I'm going to go home at 6 every day. Like, that's not what you're getting paid for. That's just not the way that works. So I think, you know, being cognizant of that and really maybe looking outside of the box about where you're thinking of working, and maybe there's a way to parlay like your previous experience into a job in-house or something where you can, you know, kind of combine those interests, and then it's a really clear path. Like, say you did, you know, you were in like technology or engineering or science or something, and now you want to go and do some sort of like technology work as a lawyer. Like, that totally makes sense. So you can, that's an easy sell. So, you know, we're going to talk about having your story ready to go, but that's a pretty obvious story.
Definitely. I think that's all things that you should keep in mind as you're sort of applying for things, because you don't want to apply all in the wrong place that doesn't make sense for you and kind of either end up with nothing or end up in a situation that's not going to be good for you. That's like that's not going to be helpful, even if, you know, you're picking things based on prestige or things like that.
Yeah, and I think this is a situation where ideally you start in law school repositioning yourself if you're really doing like a serious repositioning. So that then when it comes time to do these interviews, they look at your resume and they say, okay, we know you were a computer science undergrad, you were a programmer for 5 years, and now you're telling me you want to do human rights work. And you say yes, because, you know, as you can see, my first summer, I did a human rights internship in, you know, wherever, and I took these classes and I'm on this journal, and you've got to kind of put that story together. So if you're making a really big shift, I think you have to think about all of your classes kind of pointing that direction, and your extracurriculars and your summer jobs and all of that, so that your story actually makes sense.
Definitely. I think that's really important.
And the other thing, you've got to practice telling the story, right? So that it actually seems easy.
Yes. And you need to remember that this story is your responsibility.
Right. It's on you to like connect these pieces for someone.
It's not on them to understand why this makes sense. And you might think that's not fair. You know, why don't they get it? This is just what you want to do. But you need to make the case for yourself. And I think that's absolutely right, that you need to practice it, make sure it sounds coherent. You know, your story is what you're saying, and also your resume, your cover letter. So you might want to give it to someone who you haven't sort of explained the story to before, and see if it makes sense to them and get their, you know, their honest opinion about it.
Yeah, and I think you've got to be ready in an interview, particularly for obvious questions. And sometimes they may even be aggressive questioning. You know, lawyers tend to be some of them tend to be fairly aggressive interviewers. So if they get a weird resume, they're like, oh, this is going to be fun. You know, like, I can do this. But if you defang that by having answers ready to go, if the question is aggressive, it's really hard for somebody to keep being aggressive if you just come back with something that calmly makes sense and responds to the, obvious issue that they've raised of like, well, you haven't done this before. It's like, well, okay, but here's what I've done, and this is how this relates, and this is how it all fits together, and this is like what I'm doing. I think having specific stories ready to go to that relate really to what you've achieved in law school already can be great. So, particularly if you've achieved these despite any type of obstacles, so that you have stories basically in your back pocket you can pull out, whether it's like, oh, I really enjoyed my experience being a TA or a research assistant or whatever, winning moot court, any of these things. So that when somebody starts pushing you on, well, why are you not doing this or why are you not doing that? Well, I have these other things I can talk about.
Yeah, I think it's just about kind of practicing and being prepared.
Yeah, and trying not to come off as too defensive. Another thing I think people sometimes get tripped up by is you want to make sure it looks like you're humble and you're willing to learn. Because these other experiences, unfortunately, don't necessarily put you at a level above an entry-level legal job. That's just kind of the reality, right?
Yeah, and I think that this can be a bias that other people have. It can also, I think that sometimes comes from the reality, which is that people do sometimes feel like their work experience, really matters. And like you said, a lot of times it doesn't. It matters for you being sort of a mature person, but not necessarily for the actual work. So I would say, I think you should downplay, where it puts you in terms of, the actual like legal part of it. Because I think some employers might just sort of assume that you think that. So you want to dispel them of that right away.
Well, my understanding is that it doesn't really matter for law firms. Like, even if you have 10 years of, experience in some other role, they're not necessarily going to bring you in anything other than a first-year associate.
Exactly. The only situation I can think of, and I don't know if this would matter for class year, is maybe if you're going into IP law and you have an engineering degree, they will look at that as sort of, a bonus and kind of a big deal for them. And sometimes it might just be like, that's the only way you can get the job. But, that's the only situation where I think it might.
I've like very, very, very rarely heard of people negotiating like extra signing bonuses or something like that. But you're still basically going in as a first year. Because the thing is, you don't know anything about working in a firm. Like, okay, you've worked in a lab or you were an engineer. That's great. But you still don't know anything about being a litigator.
And it's good for you to not be given expectations that are above what you can do.
Right. I mean, you can't come in as a third year because you've never seen like discovery responses. Exactly. So like you've never taken a deposition. Like you can't, there are like steps along this path that you need to do before you can get to a level where you're equal to the other people who have had that experience. So I think part of it is, making clear you understand whatever the expectations are of this particular job that you're applying for and that you're eager to do them. So you can't come in and say, well, I mean, obviously I won't be doing document review, right? Like, I mean, that's not going to come off well.
Terrible. Yeah.
It needs to be like, okay, I understand I'm taking like a step down in terms of hierarchy, but I'm really excited because I'm pursuing this whole new career. And I just think it's going to be so fantastic and it's just going to be great and like, positive, positive, positive.
Definitely.
All right. Well, we're close to out of time now. Any final thoughts on this?
My final thoughts are, we've talked mostly about, students who have work experience or kind of further out in their life. And I think the thing to remember is that personally, from the employer side, I always thought that was a positive. We really liked students with work experience, and it could be quite a bit of work experience. And so go into it with a positive attitude that all of this stuff is a good thing, because I actually think that's what employers think.
I agree. I mean, whenever I interviewed people who were a little less traditional, it was just kind of like, okay, you're a grown-up. Like, I don't have to worry that you're not going to show up to work because you're hungover, because you're out partying all night long. I mean, maybe that happens. Yeah. Maybe it was unfair on my part to the younger people in the audience, but I think people just have an expectation that you're being probably more realistic about what you're getting into. You've worked previously. You understand how working works, that you actually have to go every day at a certain time, and that's kind of a drag. In a way that somebody who's never had a professional job just doesn't really actually understand yet.
Definitely.
All right. Well, Sadie, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. For more career help and the opportunity to work one-on-one with us, you can check out careerdicta.com. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app because we'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Allison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.